Welcome to Homebrewed Christianity. My name is Bo Sanders, and we are pleased, as part of the commemorations and celebrations of the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, to release this audio called We Are All One, the Human Rights Campaign panel discussion from Wild Goose. One of the highlights of this year's festival was a panel discussion organized by the Human Rights Campaign and hosted by Dr. Sharon Groves, the director of the Human Rights Campaign Religion and Faith Program. In Groves' words, 2013 will go down in the history books as one of the most pivotal years for religious leaders working on justice issues. People of faith in unprecedented numbers are instrumental in bringing about the tremendous gains that the LGBTQ community has enjoyed, culminating in a Supreme Court decision to repeal the Defense of Marriage Act. People of faith also saw the gut-wrenching loss to the sacred civil rights legislation, most particularly in the Supreme Court's other decision to dismantle the Voting Rights Act, for which many have given their lives. The effects of these two decisions rest heavily on our collective conscience and forces us to recommit to civil rights activist Bayard Rustin's core organizing tenet: we are all one. So this panel discussion was subtitled Southern Faith Leaders Reframing the Work for Freedom and Justice. The panel included Caitlin Breedlove, co-director of Southerners on New Ground Song, Bishop Tanya M. Rawls, founding pastor of Unity Fellowship Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, and the Reverend Dr. T. Anthony Spearman, senior pastor of the Clinton Tabernacle African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in Hickory, North Carolina. So, we hope that you enjoy this lively conversation. This is We Are All One, Human Rights Campaign panel discussion from Wild Goose Festival 2013. If you like what you hear, we have one request. Don't forget to share the brew.
We have a precious hour, and this is an amazing group. So I want to just get us started. So my name is Sharon Groves, and I direct the Religion and Faith Program for the Human Rights Campaign. And if you don't know the Human Rights Campaign, it's located in Washington, D.C., and it's a national advocacy organization on all issues that affect lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people. And in that, there's a whole educational wing, and as part of that, we are able to do what I think is just some of the most profound work that I've gotten to do in my entire life, which is to work with religious communities around really building inclusive LGBT spaces and helping to mobilize religious leaders for advocacy work across the LGBT spectrum of issues. We've got a tent that's right across from the main stage, so come by and see us. We've got T-shirts and lots of things. So what I wanted to do today was to bring a panel together of people that are working on what we like to call the sort of intersections of issues that concern us. So often those of us that do justice work kind of do work on one particular set of issues and not on another issue. And what we found in North Carolina is that we see this kind of really rich cross-fertilization, and a movement is starting, I think, here that's very, very exciting to me. And these folks are amazing leaders, and they've been working together for quite some time. So what I thought was that we would just have a conversation, and you could learn about what Southern organizing in the North Carolinian context is looking like. So let me introduce these folks, and then we'll just start in a conversation, and I'll try to leave some time at the end, so if you all have questions, you've got a chance to kind of enter into the conversation. So at the far end is Reverend Dr. T. Anthony Spearman, and he is the senior pastor of the Clinton Tabernacle African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in Hickory, North Carolina. That is a mouthful to say that. And he's the executive director of Clinton's Corner of Catawba Community Development Corporation, which largely deals with the plight of those in the throes of poverty. He serves on the governing board of the North Carolina Council of Churches. He's also the third vice president of the North Carolina NAACP. And his biography goes on and on and on. So, but he's going to talk a lot about the activist work he's going to do. So he does. So I'll stop there except to say that he is one of the architects for the Moral Monday work that's just so profound that's been happening in this state. So next is Bishop Tanya Rawls, who is the founding pastor of Unity Fellowship Church, Charlotte, the founder and executive of the Freedom Center for Social Justice, and prelate of the 4th Jurisdiction Unity Fellowship Church Movement.
That's a mouthful, too.
Yes, it is. What's with these long titles? I cannot possibly memorize them. Yeah, that's true. Bishop Rawls was a key member of the North Carolina Faith Programs Advisory Board, the chair for the board's People of Color Task Force, and a leader with local Faith Coalition partner, Clergy for Equality Charlotte. She helped to form and implement the faith strategy at the state and local level and help lead efforts to broaden the NAACP coalition to include LGBT leadership and reach out to African American faith leaders who are on the fence or yet to be active on the work for Amendment 1. Caitlin Breedlove is the co-director for a fabulous organization called Southerners on New Ground, SONG, which is a Southern regional LGBTQ organization founded in 1993 to bring community organizing across race, class, culture, gender, and sexuality. Breedlove represented SONG on the steering committee for the campaign against the North Carolina constitutional ban on same-sex marriage, Amendment 1, and SONG's North Carolina field organizer served as the campaign deputy director for Faith Outreach. Breedlove also served, I'm reading the script and I should stop. Caitlin also served as the design team for the recent mountaintop gathering that convened by Auburn Seminary, which is a really interesting group that was trying to figure out how do we do intersectional, interfaith work. And she's been a fantastic multi-faith leader in that work and in much else. So that's who we've got here. And I thought I would start, and again, I really want to get at this question about what's happening in North Carolina and what is this sort of this Southern organizing that we're seeing that's really crossing a whole number of issues. So I wanted to start with Reverend Spearman and ask if you could describe the work that you all did for the historic 1000 on Jones Street, which I think was a starting point in some ways for this collaboration.
Thank you, Sharon. Fall 2006, the leadership of the North Carolina NAACP was coming up on the 100th year anniversary of the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and we're very, very concerned with what had become the misperception of many that the NAACP was largely a civil rights organization that was for black people, people of color. And in order to make an attempt to delve through that misperception, there was a meeting in the fall of 2006 wherein there was a group of people who came together to discuss how to get around that misperception. And the creation of the historic Thousands on Jones Street, better known as HK on J movement, began at that point. The first meeting of which took place in February of 2007. And there were thousands of people who converged upon Jones Street where, the General Assembly is held. And around a succinct 14-point agenda, we began coming together in what we call a fusion movement. That is key to what Bishop Rawls describes as that Southern organizing that takes place. And it goes back, it goes back to the civil rights days, the antebellum times. when there were a number of things that happened that had people coalescing together to come together over various issues that were taking place. So that's the movement, Historic Thousands on Jones Street, which began with a 16 organization. We call it the Sweet 16. There were 16 organizations, progressive organizations, that came together and made an effort to say, okay, we're going to come together to make an attempt to work on these issues that we're faced with in North Carolina. And now there's over 160 progressive organizations that have come together in coalition.
That's amazing. And that was that where you three met, or had been working together before then?
I primarily met Dr. Spearman through that, but Caitlin and I had been doing intersectional work for some time together. So HK on J was an interesting way of, I think part of the work we did was really plugging in many instances, in those ways that sexual orientation and gender identity also kind of got bumped out in the discussion. Yeah. And so that the fact that there was a platform called HK on J already in existence was something, again, in terms of talking about this kind of Southern way, the table was broad enough that a new seat was brought in and space was made.
So I wonder if you could talk about that, about how difficult was it in those earlier years to be able to actually bring sexual orientation, gender identity into the discussion of larger justice movement work?
Yeah, Caitlin would be a good one to talk about that, because actually, in an interesting kind of way, some of the work Song did, Southerners on New Ground, really was some of the initial connections with the NAACP and other groups that would have seemed like organizations and entities that would not necessarily have been as open and welcoming. And again, giving credit to Mandy Carter, who was just such a great activist in the area as well. But Caitlin could probably speak a little better to these initial engagements.
I think the short answer to that would be that it was hard, like many things. And I think a lot of people, thank you, Bishop, I think a lot of people that are now mostly in their 60s and 70s who are Southern and who are lesbian, gay, bi, and trans really made it possible for us to be doing this kind of work now. It was not the same kind of conversation. And actually, when Song kind of entered the phase it's in now, starting in 2006, we had a pretty moving set of workshops around the South where LGBT people who were totally committed to social justice movement in the South said, we're heartbroken because these organizations will take our work, take our sweat, take our minds, everything we got, we give to these organizations, but we're not allowed to say our names. Because the agreement is, as long as you don't talk about it, you can be in these organizations. And I actually think it's the work of, LGBTQ leaders that said we're not willing to do that anymore. Like, we need to be able to bring our whole selves. But it's also the work of people who are doing amazing ally work, particularly in smaller communities like Hickory, that said, no, we don't expect that anymore. And I think that's a place where there has actually been a lot of healing that's been possible, where we've been able to build trust and build deeper relationship because we decided, no, we're not going to do that anymore. And we're also not going to accept that folks of color are being asked to come to spaces and not talk about incarceration and not talk about racism and not talk about what's really happening. We're just not going to do that anymore. We're going to start telling the truth, and then we're going to start thinking about solutions. And to me, that was the shift that I was privileged to get to come into. And I think that's been shaped by many, many people.
So that's interesting, and I'd love you to just expand on that a little bit. I know that LGBTQ organizations, my own HRC included, have come under some fire lately for we've been the wind is on our back, it seems, and we've come under some fire for being too narrow in our focus and not strong enough on issues like immigration, the Voting Rights Act. And I wonder if you could speak to what you've been doing, and Bishop Rawls, it would be great if you could as well, as LGBT organization that is actually sort of shifting, reframing how we think about our work.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the one of the problems has been that fear and scarcity has led what issues we choose. And when we let fear and scarcity define, when we let ourselves think about social justice in terms of a zero-sum game, we might win in the short term, but we're actually losing long term. So one example I just give, and, we wanted to really focus and respect what Sharon asked. I don't want to give you a whole diatribe of everything Song has done, but one of the things we did a couple years ago was fight against the Arizona copycat legislation in Georgia. And this legislation not only criminalized undocumented people of color, but said you can't ride in cars together if you're documented and undocumented. You can't harbor people who are undocumented in Song's office, or you can't eat together. And so many people in our Black LGBT base said, we have to do something about this. We know what this sounds like. And so we actually were able to defeat the harboring clause. While we lost the bigger campaign, we defeated that part of it, and we did it through using stories with several coalition partners that were amazing. But I just bring up that because I think that actually the gay press reported that we were able to mobilize more LGBT people in Atlanta than had moved for anything in the past 15 years besides gay marriage. And what I attribute that to is asking us, where do we actually stand? What are we coming out as? Are we coming out as gay, or are we coming out as queer liberationists? Which to me is really, when I think about what our work is about, it's about thinking about how we're connected to all the liberation struggles. So to me, it is less about saying, gay marriage is bad. Is that good or bad? And it's more about what spirit we bring and what message we bring to how we frame everything we do, which is why Song would say, the kind of relationships that are built here with this work, it's the shared spiritual and political imperative that then grounds and builds the trust to move out. So does that answer your question? And I would love to hear what Bishop has to say, too. She might have other thoughts.
Yeah, I think that, I know there's a question that'll probably come down the pike, so I'll kind of raise it. When we were preparing for this session together, I do a lot of national work as well. And so probably prior to the last couple of years, the bigger body of my work was done actually out of the South and out of North Carolina. And there was some work that was being done. Amendment 1 was one of the things that really centrally had me focusing on North Carolina and really focusing on the South. But I will say that the NAACP, for me, something transformative happened 2 years ago. And the transformation happened because, I sit in several seats. So I am a black woman, and that's not going anywhere. Even if I do the Michael Jackson skin coloring, it's not going anywhere. I'm still black. I am a woman, and, that is who I am. And that not just based on my genitalia, based on how I am wired on the inside. I am woman. And then also I am lesbian, and I am a person of strong faith. So all of those cards are cards that I hold dearly. And the NAACP was doing some pretty significant work in reference to things like voting rights issues and disenfranchisement. We were going through a lot of the shifts in voting districts and the like. And also they were doing a lot of work around education. At the end of the day, so much of what we talk about when I talk about the distinction between what happens when I hear organizations out of the South saying I'm coming into the South to do work is that it is saying that I am coming down to organize in the South. Now that is a frame. And then there is another frame that we mainly live in, which is Southern organizing. And those are two very distinct conversations. And the Southern organizing way is the way, particularly now, as Caitlin noted, many of us are not willing to leave any of our cards out. Reverend Spearman is an ally, but he has not left out the fact that I have sisters and brothers whose orientation is different than mine, but my faith mandate and who I am as a man of color, I know what it is like to be left out, to be excluded. I'm bringing all those cards in, and that means I have to welcome my sisters and brothers who happen to be LGBT. And for me, it meant that the educational fight is my fight. That the fight around immigration is my fight. And so all of our work kind of converged in this way that was very naturally integrationalist for us, where we were able to not have to be distracted so much from our core work, because again, we only have so many resources. Right. But there were these sweet spots that we all could solidly stand in and do work with a great deal of integrity that allowed us to be incredibly successful. So when I met Reverend Spearman for the first time, I will say that my first interaction with the NAACP, I came with some trepidation because I have my frame of who they are, and I had to start from the margin. We met at the margin. And because of that, now the bigger frame is there. And it's been incredible. And I want to suggest that they played a key role in helping to ensure some of the victories we had along the way happened because of how unapologetically strong many stood in the Southern organizing way.
Beautifully said, Bishop Rawls, and I appreciate your speaking about that because I actually had a lot of angst, if you will, with stepping out on my faith with regard to some of the LGBT issues. And remember having conversations and dialogue with those who were close to me in social. Said, you know, it's my time. It's my time to step out and to embrace the LGBT community. And one of my, I'm not going to say who, but one of my colleagues said, well, I can guarantee you this: if you step out and see what happens as a result, we'll join you in that battle. And indeed they did. So they came along afterwards and they did that.
And let me just say, and that's code for if you survive.
Yeah. That's exactly right.
But if we're not looking at roadkill, we'll come and, you know, so he survived, thank God.
And at that point, by that point, one personality that had become I had been kind of following his travels quite a bit was a Protestant pastor by the name of Martin Niemöller. And he once upon a time, during the time of Adolf Hitler, said something that had become famous. They came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one to speak out for me. And so, you know, I embrace that philosophy and say, you know, my today it is as the T-shirt that Sharon is wearing, we are all one, which was made famous by Bayard Rustin, who was a fabulous organizer, and who on August 24th we're going to Washington, D.C., and we're going to do some celebrating of some of the work that he did that has gotten lost, you know, for reasons because he was marginalized, an African-American male who was an openly gay person who had a whole lot to offer, but now, you know, everybody else is getting the credit for the things that he did.
Yes, and for those of you that don't know Bayard Rustin, so he really was the person that organized the famous March on Washington. And we're so excited that we just learned literally yesterday that he's going to posthumously be given the Presidential Medal of Honor. So... So you kind of jumped the question.
I know.
This was the last question, but maybe since you went there, let's go to the last and then we'll come back. But I wonder, when you think about Bayard Rustin, this is somebody that was a Quaker. This was a peace activist. This is a peace activist in a time, not during the Vietnam War, but World War II. He was advocating for nonviolence. He was one of a number of people, but he was one of a key people that introduced King to Gandhi's work. And always was kind of in the margins in all of the communities he was in. There's a wonderful film about him called Brother Outsider. He was inside and outside. He was at the core, at the center, and at the margins. So I wonder if you all might just reflect for a moment, given that he's getting this Presidential Medal of Honor. It's kind of perfect timing. what is what lessons, what does his legacy teach us about how we think about our work today as we move forward?
I will say that my work has been made so much easier because every time I have a moment, and I do have them, moments when I am marginalized as a woman, marginalized as a black person, marginalized as someone queer, I am always mindful of how fortunate I am. I am of an age where I didn't have classmates drafted to war. I don't know that experience of war as such in terms of it touching people very close to me like that, unless they volunteered to be in the military. I don't know what it is like outside of in a museum to have to make very specific choices about where I choose to quench my thirst. I don't. That is not an experience I had. And so whenever I think it is hard, I am mindful of what a Bayard Rustin had to do. What did it mean for him as an openly gay man working with black preachers in a movement that at that time, what we consider it really big and popular, it was everything but that, actually, at the time. What was that like? And what kind of courage did it take when black folk and white folk chose to come together and as people of faith or just as neighbors and say, we're going to do this differently? What did it mean when those people did that first? And I believe that every generation has a gift of a moment. And I am of the mind that the LGBTQ child of God is the gift to this generation. And I say that very seriously. It pushes at all of our margins. It just pushes us. And I have shared with my friends before and colleagues, I believe that we just might, not everybody, because not everybody wins in these situations, but I think just maybe the church proper will be ahead of science for the first time. That is a quiet thing I kind of hold. That we won't wait until science tells us, well, actually, there are scientific reasons that orientation shows up differently. Actually, there is scientific proof that gender plays out differently, right? And what would happen if we didn't have to wait for science to tell us that that was the case? Science had to tell us that was the case with women, and then finally people were like, well, wow, they're not more stupid than men. In fact, I could argue, no, but anyway.
Don't go there.
And wow, black people really, are human beings. Science proved that, right? And so then it became irrefutable. But wouldn't it be fascinating if, as people of God, we could press past our biases in the ways that a Bayard did, in the ways that, so many others, Sojourner Truth, just that people just pressed and love provoked them, often their faith provoking them. That's the highest hope I hold for many of us.
I would just add briefly, I feel like much has been said already, but when I think about Bayard Rustin, I think about his discipline. I think about him as a strategist. And I think about him as an internationalist, and by that I simply mean someone that never seemed to let the people around him forget that other people are suffering too, and that nobody has the corner on suffering throughout time or throughout moments, that place matters, and the way that he really, throughout his life, pushed himself to be politicized by so many different communities and different spaces, I think leaves us so much.
He was a principled man.
That's a good word.
He was principled. And he had the uncanny, innate ability to press past his own personality in order to approach the matters of the day, which I think kept him so in tune with the sign of the times that were happening in his midst. And I believe, that's what made the difference in him being so focused. He remained focused to a fault. He remained focused throughout. And some of those unfortunate things that happened to him because others weren't able to do that.
So there's a couple words that are resonating: focus, principle, strategic. One of the anxieties people have when we talk about doing intersectional work, so when it's like an organization like mine that does LGBT work, and what would it mean for us to in a robust way engage, for instance, on the Voting Rights Act, right? So one of the critiques that we hear is we'll lose our focus, we won't be strategic, we'll become too diverse, too diffused in our energies. And it seems to me that Bayard Rustin was about as focused and as strategic, as you all pointed out, as you can be, and yet constantly pushed the envelope about who was included, right, and who needed to be part. And I wonder about that legacy for us, about are there ways for us to think that in terms of being focused and strategic and yet having a vision that is expansive and growing.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that really excites me is when I take the initiative to show up at an event that may not be focused on the LGBT issues. And I look out and there's Caitlin Breedlove, and there's Bishop Rawls. Embracing these issues. It speaks volumes for me, because we're expressing the willingness to join others to press past some of these issues that we're faced with. And I think that's the spirit of the times, that's the needful spirit of the times in which we live in order to get where we're going. And that's why the movements that we are forging, that we're creating, and that we're cultivating are happening and are working. And that's why you have the Moral Monday movements in Raleigh, North Carolina, and abroad. Because last week there was one up in Asheville, North Carolina. I wasn't able to be there. I was in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, but was able to be there through the live streaming. And it was just so exciting seeing the numbers of people in Asheville, in the Western Quadrant, that you normally see in Central Raleigh. And so, the word is catching on. People are tired of the madness that's going on around us. It's like, come on, we've got to get to a point where we're able to deal with one another from a moral standpoint. Because if we don't, we're going to be the demise of one another.
That's wonderful. So let's dig into that a little bit around the moral piece. I think for a long time now, the religious right has claimed the moral high ground, or at least attempted to. You all, this is a faith festival. You all are faith leaders. What is the role of faith in the work that you're doing and that you see at this moment?
That's a great question. My faith actually is the thing that frames everything I do.
That's right.
That it is the platform upon which all my work gets done. And I want to suggest I am a fundamentalist. And so there are people who would say, well, what do you mean? I don't think you get any more fundamental, and my platform is the Christian faith. I don't think I get any more fundamental in my faith than when it is anchored in love and broad inclusion. So that is a term that I don't, like my other cards, allow anybody to take from me. And when thinking about that, we were chatting a little earlier about family, like how you define kind of family. And one of the things I've noted about Southern organizing is that everybody makes grits. Okay, so I noticed the rain is loud, but everybody makes grits, okay? And everybody cooks greens, okay? It is not soul food. And I have seen some white folk make me have to question my heritage in terms of what they did to some grits and some greens, okay? So I say that to say my family, my tribe looks different. And that is a tribe that is largely faith-based, because, again, that's one of the things very unique about organizing in the South, is that we don't feel compelled to leave our faith outside the door, that we bring that in to the work. And actually, that's very comfortable for me. Mm-hmm. And so what it challenges me around is being open to how God, so I can use my God talk here, how God introduces me to new members of the family. Yeah. And it makes it easier for me to be able to move past those lines of seeming difference to find that actually we all really like some good grits. And it's a wonderful equalizer in terms of how we do the work. You know, there is no difference between Caitlin and I. Her German and Polish background and my African American background, I feel no distinction as such. Not that we're oblivious to race and class and all of that, but there is enough commonality that it's a non-issue. And the same with our brother, Reverend Spearman, right? Because we all like grits. Yeah.
To kind of put a spin on what Bishop Ross has said, I would say it this way with regard to the importance of faith. Without my faith, I don't believe I'd be able to withstand this struggle.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely no way.
Absolutely.
And so, as a result, I have to take it everywhere I go.
Absolutely.
The battle cannot be won.
Yeah.
The war cannot be won without faith.
Yeah.
I think, for me, I think a lot about how, especially in the LGBT community, we talk a lot about acceptance and accepting ourselves as we are. And there's a big difference between accepting ourselves as we are and our identity and accepting ourselves as finished products, as leadership. I don't know if anybody else makes any mistakes or has ever done anything wrong or, has weaknesses that play out in the work we're trying to accomplish. I know I do. I have a lot, and I refuse to accept that we are not all called on to expand and do more. I don't think we need to be contracting. I don't accept it from myself. I don't accept it from anyone on our staff. I don't accept it from the members that lead the work of this organization, because I think the conditions of what are happening in our world as people of faith, as spiritual people, and by that I would mean people who think there is legacy and there is sacredness that's in and beyond us. I just think that those are important enough that it is worth working to expand ourselves. And so for me, I also think that's where we make the possibility to have a loving sense of humor about our egos, about our potential martyrdoms, about our ongoing mistakes. I mean, I think the question of focus around the LGBT movement is partially about that. It's also about having to look at the other side of focus is self-interest, right? And really having to look at, maybe it's not just about me. Maybe there is something wider, and maybe I get something from that too when I start moving from that place. And I completely agree. I don't think that without spiritual foundation, the political work, I think, can only go so far. And I think what we have to figure out is how we bring those together in a way that doesn't exclude or create space for only one tradition.
Right. I think it's Mandy Carter that has made famous that line, justice can never just be just us. Yeah. So I'd like to ask one more question and then open it up to all of you. And when we were planning this, we had a really rich conversation on the phone, and we talked about some of the work that you all are doing together, which I think we've got into quite a bit of that, the work that you do individually, but then there's that invisible work, the growing edges, the places where we need to go, the things that we can't yet see. And I wonder if you could reflect on, from your own vantage point, what those might be for you right now.
We're beginning to do, the Freedom Center for Social Justice is getting ready to launch actually next Friday, the region's first LGBTQ Law Center, and also a transgender employment program. I have to say that it is some of the most humbling work I've done in a long time, because we throw the term LGBT around a lot, but in reality, it's really LG work. Not even bi, because we think they're all confused. So it's really just been this lesbian gay work and not the B and T. And so we made a very conscious decision to kind of reach to the farthest, what we perceive to be the kind of furthest edge. And not furthest edge in that they're the furthest edge, as I've sit in the ally seat, but furthest edge in terms of how they're often marginalized, right? And I had the frames of being a woman of faith and a faith leader, especially as one of the first women bishops in my denomination. And I had the frame of what it meant to be a black person. And so it wasn't difficult to say, in this allied situation, it's uncharted territory for me personally. And work that I'm very excited about, but it's humbling because so this is an interesting kind of blowback from this, right? So what it forces me to have to do is, in situations where I would be more ready to go and judge someone else's position that I may feel marginalized as me, I have to say, oh my God, what a blind spot I had in reference to this population. So for me as an ally, it is actually helping me to just be a better person. So I think it's very difficult if, when we step to work as leaders, we leave out the fact that we've got our own stuff. And unless, especially as faith leaders, unless we are willing to deconstruct that piece, then the work is not, I don't think you can really do it authentically, because you have to own your own struggles and sometimes hard truths in the midst of trying to do justice work, because every single one of us is a have and a have not. And so if all you can see is that you're a have not, then you're just as dangerous as the person that believes that they have no areas of need, no areas of weakness, on and on and on. So we're finding it very interesting in this margin of the trans community and those ways that we're beginning to do very intentional work there as it relates to justice issues, as it relates to faith, race, class, on and on.
Great.
I would add, I think one of the interesting things is that as terms sometimes become buzzwords in movements, it's because there has been work for a long time. So when we say intersectionality, and when that's a conversation about intersections coming together, it's because of so much work that is happening. And I think at the same time, one of the things that we've been thinking about a lot now is just what work becomes visible, right? What actually makes it in the media, what makes it, in other places, and how we're valuing work in rural communities, work with poor communities. One thing we find really interesting with media, and I wonder if you all find this as well, is the actual working with poor people. As the number of poor people increase in this country, the media actually doesn't even like to show poor people as poor as the people we work with. And I'm sure some of y'all work with as well, and I know you two work with, don't actually want to show that kind of poverty. There's a certain, quote, anti-shabbiness. Like, we don't show that. And sometimes it's been interesting, people have said, well, we don't show the song members because, they all look like these sort of crunchy granolas. And I was like, well, that's interesting, because actually all of our membership starting to dress fairly similar, as a lot of them have less and less money. Like, it's actually about who is getting that visibility. And I think the challenge then becomes, and that's why I so appreciate Sharon bringing us together, is how do big organizations think about smaller organizations, and how do regional and national organizations think about work rooted in place? Because there's very important infrastructure that can be brought from big organizations, but the relationships that stay and define changing a region take a really long time. That work takes a long time. And so I would invite that one of the places where, we talk some about, are there strategies that we're seeing across the region? So, songs organizing in Alabama and our organizing in Virginia look very different. But a couple common conversations is, what are leaders and what is public space and public life going to be in the 21st century? So what does it mean to be a leader? And do we sort of accept individual icons or traditional ideas of leadership we have? Or are we willing to take the good from that and add to it? And then what does it actually mean to be in public space or in marginalized? I often use the example of looking at the image of, in the small town where we live, there's a transgender woman of color, and when she walks past a certain mechanic shop, she literally covers her face, hoping that men who may be choosing to harm her will not see her face. And I think that's where the incredible work around voting rights needs to be spun, and forgive me for that sort of trite word, but in a different way, because it's about whether we accept or do not accept that some voices are just not heard, whether we accept an anti-community, if you will, for 21st century living, that actually it's either us or fine with us, that voices are completely marginalized and that people become literally invisible, not just figuratively. So when I think about visibility, I think about all of those things, because I think it's actually about whether we're recognizing humanity itself in the communities that we're part of.
And what I love about that, I just want to kind of like lift up, is this notion that, is it fine with us? That there's something that goes on in us that makes it okay for that transgender person to actually have to hide their face. We're okay with that, and really work with that. It's beautiful. Thank you. Reverend Spearman.
Yeah. If the truth be told, in the community where I live, a great deal of my time is spent doing what I would refer to as intersectional work with other ministers. And I can assure you that it's very, very tedious and hard work. Because oftentimes I find myself, and I thank God for it, that He has somehow given me the courage to be a catalyst, to have that capacity where I get in your face and just tell you what I need to tell you. And oftentimes there are two, just to kind of give you a sense of what I'm talking about, there are two Hickory ministerial alliance. One is predominantly black and the other is predominantly white. And of course the predominantly white group are those who do church with those who have money. And the predominantly black group are those who do church with those who don't have money. And so when we come together across those barriers, oftentimes the conversation is such that those on the other side of the tracks are aloof, oblivious to how we do ministry. And are oftentimes kind of blown away by some of the things that we tell them. Well, with the Moral Monday movement and what have you, we have on Wednesdays, some of us meet. It's called a racial reconciliation group. Now, I don't know why we named it that, because in order to reconcile something, it has to first be conciled, and I don't know that it ever was. But that's another discussion. But I was able to, from that standpoint of Moral Monday and with some of the information that I have to bring forward, to help them to see some things differently. And that's what makes all of the difference to be able to help people to start looking at something differently. I think that's what gets them to the table. And so the pre-intersectionality work is very, very vital to getting them to the table, wherein we can push forward and start doing some other things. As a matter of fact, there's a person here today. I don't want to do anything for his anonymity, but I'm glad to know that he's here, and he's one of the arrestees in the Moral Monday movement, Pastor Michael Cosdale from Lenore, North Carolina. Give him a round of applause.
Thank you.
And he and I had the pleasure of driving to Raleigh, North Carolina with him, and for the first time kind of just touching base with him about things, and knowing that he is a person that has the same kind of drive that I have, but he doesn't look like me.
Yeah.
You look at him. That's my brother. Yeah. And that's the beauty of this movement, this coalition building that we're doing, and that we will continue to do. Yeah, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. That just if I may. Caitlin brought up a wonderful point, and I think it really speaks to this whole concept, or what's happening with the voters' rights piece. She talked about contraction and expansion. If you look at things, what's happening in Raleigh is that they're seeking to contract and take away voting rights from people, when it seems to me that we should be moving in the other direction. Right. What is the fear? What are you afraid of? Right. Why don't we just embrace change and move forward? But of course, there are certain things that are driving it. We know that they're all political, and some are racial, and all of that stuff. And the three foci of the HK-on-J movement was anti-racism, anti-poverty, and what's the third? Anti-war. Those three. Very, very simple, very focused. And the 14 points flow in line, or fall in line with that three foci, that three focused agenda. And so, we when we maintain our focus, stay true to it, what we get as a result is the kind of movement that you're seeing that's driven by these Moral Monday movements, which are now getting ready to take on a new form, because they're going to ultimately become simultaneous movements in 13 areas where the General Assembly live, in the congressional districts. And I know that based on what happened up at Asheville, we're going to see some things happen, and we're going to be blessed as a result of the things that are going to happen.
Thank you. So we've got about 10 minutes, and I think I'd like to open this. No? How much?
She said 5.
Okay, we have 5 minutes, so we have time for a few questions. I can turn this mic around. Oh, she's got a mic. Never mind. Okay, so does anyone have a question or a comment? Got one in the back there.
Hello. Can you tell me what the Moral Monday, what the points are again? What are you trying to accomplish with that movement?
We're trying, one of the main things that we set out to do was to help the people in the state of North Carolina, to understand what's really going on in the General Assembly, to expose a lot of the regressive tactics that are taking place there in the House, in the General Assembly, with our legislators.
I want to say to that point, because that's a great question. So I was one of the ones also arrested during Moral Monday, and it was fascinating to think about kind of who's on the bus with you. It's also fascinating to think about, definitely as a person of color, voluntarily giving myself up for arrest for the first time, and there was a reason I did it, because I felt that the voices, the volume of the stories were not raising out of kind of the basement. And when you start seeing bishops and pastors and faith leaders saying, not on my watch, and I'm willing to offer myself up, that is the point when the news started getting out. It literally took that degree of civil disobedience. And I think each one of the hundreds of us who did that with that in mind. And I also did it discouraging many of my young people who wanted to do it. It was like, well, we're not going to let you go by yourself. And I said, you can't have a record, okay? So, but you know what I'm saying? So kind of protecting many of the younger ones around us. But there is a statement that I have, and it ties to an earlier question that Sharon had talked about. And that is that notion of when we can, we must. Do you know what I'm saying? Like when do you when do you say this is too much of a distraction? You know, because we all have busy schedules and on and on. But it was worth the 3-hour drive to Raleigh. It was worth the hours in jail and being shackled. It was worth all of that because it was mine uniquely to do. And I think each of us has that thing. And it is ours to do. And unless we really get that these moves are not just about poor folk and not just about people of color, that it is going to have generational impacts on the South, not even just North Carolina, we're really missing some stuff. So these Moral Mondays have been vital in making the state aware, state residents aware of what is really going on.
So I think we have time for one more question. Anyone? I think you. Thanks.
Hi, thanks so much. I guess y'all are talking a lot about North Carolina. I'm coming from Tennessee, East Tennessee even, but I'm thinking even more on a national scale. It feels like in 2008, the night Obama was elected was also the night that Prop 8 was defeated in California. And it has felt then and ever since then that the nation is almost tearing white folks and people of color apart. And then in this year, that reversed with the Voting Rights Amendment in Supreme Court and DOMA. So I feel like I always have this tension that we're never allowed to all celebrate together.
Yeah.
How do we get beyond that?
It's a great point.
Wow.
I think it has so much to do with how we see our we, how we see our we. Because I think I want to just hear that is a real emotion. And sometimes we have our emotion and we have our logic, right? But in order to get past that, I think we really have to look at how, particularly, I don't want to make assumptions about how old you are, but maybe we're a similar generation that, starting with Reagan in a particular way, which I'm not saying it wasn't true before, but Reagan's time in a particular way and that era, as white young people in high schools, we were sold a certain bill of goods. There's a great book by Jean Hardesty called Mobilizing Resentment. I think it's the two best words put together about the 80s and 90s and the way that white people were told that all the things wrong in our lives were actually the fault of folks of color, right? And it's just not true. And the division you're talking about, I think one of the possibilities is how did those of us who are white really come into a redemptive process that's about telling the truth first, right? How can we reconcile if there's not honesty? And how do we do some of that work with ourselves so that it's not always on our folks of color brothers and sisters and family to be always doing that work. And that doesn't mean, as one of my coworkers says, the smackdown committee, right? That isn't about the good white people and the bad white people. So let's just be honest. That's often what happens in the spaces. It's about a process of how do we reconcile with the state of what we've learned and then the state of what is so that we could build a real we, And I think that I'll just say real quick, SONG has always been a multiracial organization, and it's a majority people of color organization now in its leadership, but not in its membership. It's still multiracial in its membership, but the majority of the board and staff and member leaders are folks of color. And, it's really interesting sometimes what other white folks ask me about that. Like, I call it the "are you getting voted off the island" conversation, right? The sense of scarcity, like, well, are you leaving? Like, are you being pushed out? Like, as a white leader, and I just talked to them about the incredible unlocking that has happened for white people within the organization to finally move past trying to take control of every situation and understand what it means to follow organic leadership of people who are being experts on their own lives. And we're all experts on our own experience. So I'd love to continue that conversation with you because I really appreciate having the honesty about it, because if we don't start with that, we can't actually move through. So now,
I think we're going to have, unless there's something burning that you, but what I would just say to that too is that watch what these folks are doing in North Carolina. To me, I mean, I'm just so deeply grateful and humbled by the work that I've been privileged. It's a real privilege to watch each of them and their organizations work individually and then collaboratively. And I think that they really are modeling a new way that will have enormous impact for the nation and indeed the world, which is why I wanted to be able to bring them all here today. So thank you all very much, and thanks to these three.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you.